The figures show that, while in the more developed capitalist countries the number of cattle, sheep and pigs was many times higher than the number of horses, in Russia this proportion was incomparably smaller, which indicates a much weaker development of productive livestock production. The peasants' livestock was in the worst condition. In the overwhelming majority it was mongrel and unproductive. It must also be borne in mind that already at the end of the XIX century, 60% of all peasant holdings belonged to horseless and one horse. On one horseless farm, there were an average of only 0.8 head of cattle, in translation for large livestock. Meanwhile, horseless farms accounted for about 30% of all peasant holdings. Thus, livestock raising, as well as agriculture, was at a particularly low level in the middle peasant and even more in the poor economy. To eliminate the backwardness of agriculture, it was necessary first of all to destroy the remnants of serfdom. But the Tsarist autocracy stood guard over the landlord privileges. Frightened by the enormous scale of the peasant movement of 1905-1907, the Tsarist government was forced to open a valve to weaken the revolutionary pressure. But this time, just as in 1861, tried to preserve untouched landlordism, which hindered the development of agriculture and the entire national economy of Russia. On November 9, 1906, the government issued a land law, the so-called Stolypin Law, after the Tsar's minister Stolypin, which destroyed the communal use of land. The peasants were asked to stand out from the community. The land that was transferred to their personal possession was to be taken away in one place, farm, cut. The peasant was allowed to sell his allotment. This was in the hands of the kulaks, who had the opportunity to buy up poor lands. Stolypin's law was a major maneuver of Tsarism, hoping with its help to create a solid support in the village in the face of a large class of rural bourgeoisie, kulaks. Lenin characterized the Stolypin land law as the second land reform after the 1861 reform for capitalism, as mass violence against the peasantry in the interests of capitalism, as the breaking of old land relations in favor of a handful of wealthy masters at the cost of the rapid ruin of the mass of the peasantry. Stolypin's reform was fully adapted to the interests of the landlords. In the struggle for the Prussian or American way of developing capitalism and agriculture, it was called upon to ensure the victory of the Prussian path. Stolypin's land law led to an intensification of the stratification of the peasantry and further deterioration of the situation of the landless peasants and the rural poor. Within a few years after the promulgation of this law, more than 1 million low-power peasants were completely deprived of land and ruined. Due to the land deprivation of low-power peasants, the number of kulak farms and cuts increased. Sometimes these were real estates, where hired labor was widely used. History of the CPSU, B. Short Course, p. 94. The ruin of the peasantry led to the formation of a huge relative overpopulation of the village, the hidden army of the unemployed, which in its vast part was attached to its beggarly allotments. 13 million small masters, wrote Lenin in 1908, with the most miserable, beggarly and obsolete inventory, picking up their allotment in lordly land. This is the reality of today. It is an artificial overpopulation in agriculture, artificial in the sense of the hereditary retention of those feudal relations that have long outlived themselves and could not last a single day without executions, punitive expeditions, etc. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XII, p. 274. Along with other branches of the national economy, the railway transport of Tsarist Russia lagged behind. The total length of the railway network of Tsarist Russia was second only to the United States. But in terms of the relative density of the railways, Russia stood at one of the last places. While in Germany for every 100 square meters, data as of the end of 1910, 12 versts of railways, in France, 9.8 miles, in the USA, 4.5, in Russia, the European part accounted for only 1.2 versts. The equipment of the railways was also very backward and inadequate. Since 1908, and especially since 1909, the costs of equipment of state railways, which accounted for about 70% of the entire Russian rail network, have declined extremely, only increased again in 1913. During the 5-year period from 1909 to 1913, state railways received only 11,972 freight cars and 1,471 locomotive. As a result of this management, all government railroads, with a length of 43,076 versts, had, by 1913, only 14,772 locomotives, of which 3,902 were also manufactured before 1892. A clear idea of the perfect insufficiency of this quantity is provided by the fact that private railways, stretching in 19,738 miles, there were at this time 14,552 locomotives manufactured after 1892. The location of productive forces in Tsarist Russia was characterized by unevenness and irrationality characteristic of capitalism. About half of the industry was concentrated in the central industrial regions. The Urals with its untold natural resources provided only 4.7% of the total industrial output of Russia. Siberia, 2.4%. Industrial raw materials were delivered to the central regions thousands of kilometers from Central Asia, Transcaucasia, and so on, and then the finished factories did the same huge road in the opposite direction. In the field of agriculture, the development of capitalism led to the specialization of the districts, of which some became predominantly the areas of commercial grain farming, Novorossiya, Zavolzy, others, areas of commercial cattle breeding, Baltic provinces, western, northern, industrial and part of central, etc. This specialization along with the impoverishment of the central Black Earth provinces, which resulted from the preservation of the remnants of serfdom and under the pressure of competition from the colonized steppe suburbs, led to an increase nations, consuming areas, cover their needs in bread due to the importation of producing provinces. Although conservation agriculture they would themselves could produce for a sufficient amount of bread. The uneven distribution of industry and agriculture was acutely felt during the war. By the size of the national income, Russia occupied the 4th place among the great powers of the world on the eve of the war, and the 7th largest in terms of per capita income. The national income per capita in 1914 was 94 rubles in Russia. It was 7.2 times less than in the US, 680 rubles, 5 times less than in England, 473 rubles, almost 4 times less than in France, 360 rubles, and 3 times less than in Germany, 284 rubles. It should be taken into account that the average data on the size of per capita income in the capitalist countries obscure the uneven distribution of people's income among different classes of society. The income per capita of the working population was well below 94 rubles in year. On the other hand, taxes in Tsarist Russia, as, indeed, in other capitalist countries, were built in such a way that they served as a means for additional robbery of the masses, greatly reducing their already miserable incomes. Meanwhile, state taxes grew much faster than the incomes of the population, and if the per capita national income increased from 76 to 94 rubles over the 20-year period from 1894 to 1914, thus increasing by 24%, taxes per capita of the population grew only in 15 years, from 1895 to 1910, from 10.4 to 17 rubles, i.e., 63%. As a result of the beggarly income of 94 rubles, almost 20% was spent on paying taxes. Approximately 80% of all taxes in Tsarist Russia were indirect taxes, all heavily weighted on the shoulders of the working people. In the article, On the State of Painting, Lenin wrote, "The poor and indigent weight of 9/10. The entire population consumes 9/10 all overlaid product and pays 9/10 the entire amount of indirect taxes. and yet of all, it gets the national income which 2 or 3/10. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume IV, p. 352. The economic backwardness of Tsarist Russia found its bright manifestation also in the size and structure of its foreign trade turnover, which was a typical turnover of an agrarian country that trades with industrial countries. According to the overall size of foreign trade, Russia occupied the 6th place in the world. Its foreign trade turnover in 1913 was about 2,640 million rubles. Import, 1,220 million rubles, and export, 1,420 million rubles. Life in Russia was strongly dominated by Russian exports. The export of life supplies and animals during the 5-year period from 1906 to 1910 accounted for 62% of all exports, followed by raw materials and semi-finished products, 33%, then finished goods, which accounted for only 5% of the total export. In the first place, raw materials and semi-finished products belonged, 48.3%, followed by finished goods, 29.3%, life supplies and animals stood in third place, 22.4%. It is quite typical that, despite all the poverty and economic backwardness of Russia, its state budget was much larger than the budget of France, Britain, and Germany. By the size of the public debt, Tsarist Russia was second only to France and Germany. A huge part of their income, about 25%, was received by the Tsarist government from a state monopoly for the sale of vodka, and the cost of public education in 1913 amounted to only 4.7% of all expenditures. In these figures, the entire economic, political and cultural backwardness of Tsarist Russia was exceptionally bright. It was not for nothing that Lenin wrote in 1913, "Such a savage country, in which the masses of the people were so robbed in the sense of education, light and knowledge, there was not a single country in Europe left except for Russia." Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XVI, p. 410. Comparing, further, the situation in Russia with other capitalist countries, Lenin cites such facts and figures. According to the estimate of the Ministry of Public Demission, in Lenin's words, for 1913, expenses per inhabitant were set at 80 kopecks per year, and the total cost of public education, taking into account the costs of other departments, were 1p20 kop per year per inhabitant. Meanwhile, in Belgium, England and Germany, these costs were 2 rubles, 3 or 50 kopecks, and in the USA they exceeded 9 rubles per one inhabitant. While in Sweden and Denmark there were no illiterates at all, in Switzerland and Germany, 1–2% of illiterates, in the USA, 11%, in Russia on the eve of the war, according to undoubtedly understated official data, 79% of the total population was illiterate. In 1908, there were 192 students per 1,000 inhabitants in the United States, and only 46.7 in Russia. The number of students in Russia was only about 1/5 of all school-aged children. 4/5 of the younger generation, as Lenin wrote, were condemned to illiteracy by Russia's feudal state system. To this we must add that access to educational institutions, especially in the secondary and higher, was the privilege of the upper classes, and that the Tsarist government in every possible way blocked the path to secondary and higher education for the children of petty bourgeois and peasant classes. Meanwhile, Lenin wrote, "Philistines and peasants in Russia are 88% of the population, that is, almost 9/10 of the people, and the nobles are only 0.5%, and so, the government takes money from 9/10 of the people for schools and educational institutions of all kinds, and teaches the nobility about this money, blocking the way for the petty bourgeois and peasants." IBID, p. 415. The economic and political backwardness of Russia had as a consequence the dependence of Russian capitalism and Tsarism on Western European capitalism. Lenin as early as 1895, 1896 years, noted the increased inflow of foreign capital into the industry of Russia and deeply revealed the motives that prompted foreign capitalists to transfer their capital to Russia. They, Lenin wrote, greedily attack a young country in which the government is so benevolent and obsequious to capital as anywhere else, in which the living standards of the workers, and therefore their wages, are much lower, so that foreign capitalists can receive huge profits, unheard of in their homeland. Profits. Lenin, Works, Volume I, p. 436. The last decade of the XX century was the period of the most rapid influx of foreign capital into Russia. In the future, the growth rate of foreign capital in Russia has slowed significantly, especially during the crisis and the depression of 1901-1908. The years of the revival and recovery of industry, 1910-1913, were marked by a new increase in the inflow of foreign capital. During this time, their amount increased by 72%, or by 712 million rubles, reaching 1,700.6 million rubles in 1913. In 1890, the share of foreign capital in the total amount of Russian share capital was 25%, in 1900 it was 37%, and in 1914, 43%. Out of the total amount of foreign capital to industrial enterprises, 1322 million rubles were invested in 1914, or 47% of the total amount of the industry's share capital. If we also take into account non-joint stock industrial enterprises, whose capital stock exceeded 1 billion rubles in 1913, then the share of foreign capitals was about 34% relative to the total amount of the fixed capital of industry. It should be noted that the role of foreign capital in the national economy of Russia was determined not only by the large amounts of investments, but also by the command positions that it managed to win. Such decisive branches of the national economy of Russia, as fuel and metallurgy, were in the hands of foreign capital. By the beginning of the war in 1914, 93% of the total capital invested in southern metallurgy was in the hands of foreign banks. Franco-Belgian capital prevailed here, 84.1% of all foreign capitals. In general, the metallurgy of Tsarist Russia was almost three-quarters dependent on foreign capital. The same picture was in the coal industry. In 1912, the share of 25 joint stock companies with almost exclusively foreign capital, mainly Franco-Belgian, accounted for 95.4% of the total coal mining in the Donbass, produced by joint stock companies. It is also characteristic that the boards of 19 of the above-mentioned 25 joint stock companies were in France and Belgium. In the oil industry, foreign trade unions to have almost 60% of total oil production and, moreover, concentrated in the hands of more than 3/4 oil trade in Russia. About half of the oil production was in the hands of Anglo-French capital. Regarding the machine-building industry, Lenin wrote in 1912, "The Third Duma decided to give out premiums to domestic machine builders." How domestic? Working in Russia. And it turns out that just the foreign capitalists move their factories to Russia. Customs duties are high, profits are immense, that's foreign capital and moves to Russia. The American Trust, an alliance of capitalist millionaires, has built, for example, a huge agricultural plant. Cars near Moscow, in Lyubertsy, and in Kharkov capitalist Melgos, and in Berdiansk capitalist John Greaves build agricultural machines. Is it not true? How much true Russian, domestic in these entrepreneurs? Lenin, Soch, VXV, p. 555. Foreign capital owned about 90% of the total fixed capital of the electric and electrical enterprises operating in Russia. The Russian chemical industry was financed almost exclusively by German capitalists in the form of the creation of branches of German chemical societies in Russia. The dominant position of foreign capital, mainly English, and occupied in the Russian gold industry, etc. Significantly less was the share of foreign capital in the light and food industries. In the textile industry, for example, foreign capital accounted for 21% of the total amount of fixed capital in 1915, in paper and printing industry, 20%, in the food processing industry, 8%, etc. In general, by the beginning of the war, an industry producing means production, the share of foreign capital was about 60%, and in the industry producing consumer goods, about 18%. Holding in its hands the heavy industry of Russia, foreign capital had the opportunity to influence its development in the most advantageous direction for itself, to limit this development to a certain extent and thereby preserve the technical and economic backwardness of Russia and its dependence on foreign capital. Particularly indicative in this respect was the weak development of machine building. Along with industrial investment, foreign capital flowed into Russia and in the form of bank capital, more and more subordinating Russian banks to itself. Of the 4 billion rubles that accounted for the working capital of large Russian banks at the beginning of the 20th century, more than 3 billion, or more than 75%, accounted for banks that were essentially daughter societies of foreign banks, first of all, Paris and Berlin. If we recall that the World Bank alone managed in the industry, trade and transport by $500 million capital, it becomes clear that through the Russian banks foreign capital indirectly subordinated Russian industry to it even more than by direct participation in industrial companies. The seizure of banks and heavy industry provided the foreign capital with a dominant position in the national economy of Tsarist Russia, although it was considerably inferior to Russian domestic capital. This, mainly, and determined the economic situation of Tsarist Russia, as a country that was in semi-colonial dependence on foreign capital. The inflow of foreign capital to Russia was accompanied by an even more intensive pumping out the surplus value squeezed from the workers of Russia. The growth of foreign capitals, joint stock and bonded for 27 years, 1887, 1913, amounted to 1,783 million rubles, while the net return on invested capital, net of the trade tax, was 2,326.1 million rubles for the same period. The profits of foreign capital exceeded, thus, investments by almost 30%, by more than $500 million rubles. The profits on foreign capital, placed in Russian industrial enterprises and banks, exceeded 200 million gold rubles annually. In addition, interest on foreign loans alone amounted to 600-700 million gold rubles annually. Another channel through which surplus value was squeezed out of the working people of Russia, was railway loans. For 20 years, 1891, 1910 GG, the total increase in investment of private, mainly foreign, capital in railway construction amounted to 1,587 million rubles, and the amount of income, 4,346 million rubles. Thus, foreign financial capital, with the help and support of the Russian autocracy, pumped around 2.5 billion rubles in its favor without any equivalent. The total amount of the state debt of Tsarist Russia was, as of January 1, 1914, more than 8.8 billion rubles. About 4.2 billion of them fell on external debt. If you include urban loans and various other government guarantee loans, then all external debt was expressed by a huge amount from 5.5 to 6 billion rubles. Interest, commissions and other payments on this debt, a tribute in favor of foreign capital, collected from Russian taxpayers, amounted to a huge amount. In the years prior to the war, these payments, transferred abroad, amounted to about 260 million rubles annually. Because of this debt bondage, foreign capital, primarily the Anglo-French, held in its hands not only the levers of the Russian economy, but to a large extent the Tsarist government itself. European capital saved the Russian autocracy, wrote Lenin in 1905, without foreign loans, it could not hold. It was advantageous for the French bourgeoisie to maintain their military ally, especially as long as the payments for loans were made regularly. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 7, p. 175. The loans concluded by the Tsarist government abroad, as is generally characteristic of the era of imperialism, were associated with the provision of certain economic benefits and advantages for the capitalists of the creditor countries. For example, France, having granted a loan to the Tsarist government, made certain concessions in the trade agreement of September 16, 1905, until 1917. Thus, royal loans abroad increased the general economic dependence of Russia on foreign capital. Financial dependence also increased because every year payments on previous loans increased, and new loans were required to cover them. Despite the active trade balance of Russia, its balance of payments was very tense. The surplus of exports over imports was insufficient to cover all payments. Russian domestic capital closely intertwined with foreign capital and in industry, and in banks, and in rail transport. In the most important branches of heavy industry and banks, he played a somewhat subordinate role, but here we also meet such big capitalists as Putilov, Lyanozov, Mantashev, Ryabushinsky, Vtorov, and others. In a number of other industries, especially those that were of great importance for the industrial sector, the development of Russia's cotton production, the national Russian capital occupied a very strong, dominant position. Russian domestic capital, in its turn, increasingly manifested its expansionary aspirations, seeking to seize the Dardanelles, demanding its share in the division of China, Turkey, and Persia. There is no doubt that foreign capital has hampered the development of heavy industry in Russia, pursuing two goals: the preservation of Russia's technical and economic dependence and the provision of monopoly super-profits by raising prices. Another major consequence of the dependence of Russian capitalism and Tsarism on foreign capital was an extraordinary increase in the exploitation of the working class and the working peasantry. For the oppression of our own capitalists and landowners was joined by the oppression of foreign capital, which moreover enjoyed special privileges in Russia. Supporting the Tsarist government with billions of loans, foreign capital also strengthened the political oppression of Tsarism, strengthening its position in the struggle against the revolutionary proletariat and the peasantry, in oppressing and plundering the peoples subject to Russia, in exploiting the economically backward countries of the East. Comrade Stalin gave the following remarkably bright and comprehensive description of the semi-colonial dependence of Tsarist Russia and Western European imperialism and the specific nature of the relationship between Tsarism and Western imperialism. Tsarist Russia, he says, was the greatest reserve of Western imperialism, not only in the sense that it gave free access to foreign capital holding such decisive branches of the national economy of Russia as fuel and metallurgy, but also in the sense that it could put millions of soldiers in favor of the Western imperialists. Remember the 12 million Russian army that shed blood on the imperialist fronts to ensure the frantic profits of the Anglo-French capitalists. Farther, Tsarism was not only the watchdog of imperialism in the east of Europe, but it was still an agent of Western imperialism for driving out hundreds of millions of dollars from the population for loans granted to it in Paris and London, in Berlin and Brussels. Finally, Tsarism was the surest ally of Western imperialism in the division of Turkey, Persia, China, etc. Who does not know that the imperialist war was conducted by Tsarism in alliance with the Entente imperialists, that Russia was an essential element of this war? That is why the interests of Tsarism and Western imperialism intertwined with each other and merged in the end into a single tangle of interests of imperialism. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11th, p. 5. The situation of workers in Tsarist Russia was extremely difficult, their exploitation extremely cruel and predatory. The working day in Russia was longer than in any other large capitalist country. The 10-hour day was the dominant one, including on Saturdays. In addition, overtime was widely used. But even a 10 and even 11-hour working day was far from the limit. and at many enterprises it often exceeded 12 hours. According to a survey conducted in 1913 and covering 1738047 adult factory workers, the workday was 30% of all these workers above 10 hours, 16% of the working day exceeded 11 hours, and the working day of 7.5% of workers was 12 hours. The sanitary conditions of labor of workers were terrible. The number of accidents at work has steadily increased. The total number of accidents reported by the factory inspection was, in 1904, 69,697, in 1908, 76,409, in 1912, 98,467, and in 1913, 113,344. The number of fatal accidents in the mining industry of Russia was much more than in other capitalist countries. The Tsarist government only in 1912 introduced workers' insurance in the event of illness and injury. But insurance, as Lenin pointed out, covered even the most indulgent calculations of no more than 1/6 of the Russian proletariat, leaving whole regions and categories of workers, agricultural, construction, railroads, etc., behind the Board of Insurance. It set the penniless remuneration, while at the same time placing the main part of the insurance expenses on the shoulders of workers. Workers had to deduct 2% of their earnings. In a truly hard labor, the workers received beggarly wages, which were barely enough for grub. The average annual earnings of a Russian factory worker amounted to 232 rubles in 1910, while in the United States it was 1,036 rubles in the same year, that is, more than 4 times the earnings of a Russian worker. Even in relation to the earnings of the American industrial worker in 1860, the earnings of the Russian worker in 1910 were twofold lower. Lenin remarks about this: Russia of the 20th century, Russia's 3rd June Constitution, is below a slavery America. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XVI, p. 342. But even this salary was still being cut through the system of fines and a partial replacement of the monetary salary with products. Of the 28 points of the rules of the Yuzovsky plant, the majority consisted of transferring cases when a worker was fined, lost earnings or left the factory. It is interesting to note here that the total amount of fines levied by the capitalists at the end of the period characterized by us has continuously increased. In 1908 it amounted to 433,000 rubles, in 1910, 545,000 rubles, and in 1912, 697,000 rubles. Statistical Yearbook for 1914, page 769. In Russia, even up to the imperialist war, the payment of wages has continued. Workers of the Moscow gubernia as early as 1909, almost a tenth of wages were issued by food products and goods of factory shops. This kind of payment, Lenin wrote, puts the workers in feudal dependence on the owners and gives super profits to the owners. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XVI, p. 601. The development of capitalist industry also entailed an ever-increasing replacement of men's labor by the labor of women and children in Russia. So, if the data on the number of workers of different sexes and ages in 1903 were taken as 100, then by 1912 the number of men had grown to 118.1, the number of women had risen to 149.3, and that of children and adolescents to 123.6. Statistical Yearbook for 1914, p. 764. We see, therefore, that both the number of children and adolescents, and the number of women, the latter especially, grew faster than the number of men, that female and child labor increasingly supplanted the work of adult men. In some industries, such as in most fiber processing industries, the number of women workers on the eve of the World War has absolutely exceeded the number of men. Meanwhile, the wages of a young worker amounted to approximately 1/3 of the wages of an adult man, and the earnings of a woman were only 3/5 of a man's wages. Thus, replacing the labor of men with the labor of women and children, the capitalists reduced the amount of wages paid to the workers, reduced the labor power, increased the mass of workers' labor, appropriated by capital, and the mass of surplus value. Workers lived in difficult housing conditions. According to a survey conducted in St. Petersburg in 1908, of workers with an average budget of 350 rubles. In the year 4.9% of single people were occupied by the half-box, 20.4% used only bed, 43.7% had an angle and 11.7% half-room. Of the family workers, 7.1% hired one bed for the whole family, 35.7%, an angle and 7.1%, a half-room. Thus, not only 80.7% of single workers, but also almost 50% of family workers did not even have one room. As in all capitalist countries, in pre-revolutionary Russia the years of industrial growth were replaced by years of industrial crises, stagnation of industry, which hit hard on the working class, dooming hundreds of thousands of workers to unemployment and poverty. History of the CPSU, B. Short course, P7. The economic backwardness of Tsarist Russia found its manifestation in large amounts of unemployment. To determine at least approximately the number of unemployed in the middle year, Lenin wrote, is impossible for the complete absence of any reliable statistical data, but it is certain that the number must be very great. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 3, p. 456. Partial data on the size of unemployment show that, for example, in St. Petersburg in 1911 the number of unemployed was 4.3% of the total number of workers and employees. In Moscow in 1912 there were 29.4 thousand unemployed, constituting 3.8% of the total number of workers and employees. In Baku in 1913 unemployment covered 5.9% of the total number of workers and employees. If we take into account that these figures refer to the years of industrial growth and that they are undoubtedly greatly underestimated, it will become clear that in the period 1900-1913, the average annual number of unemployed in the whole of Russia was not less than 500,000. The monstrous, predatory exploitation of workers provided unprecedentedly high profits to domestic and foreign capital in Russia. In the well-known article, The Workers' Earnings and the Profits of the Capitalists in Russia, Lenin shows that the rate of surplus value in 1908 exceeded 100% in Russia, that is, workers worked for themselves for the lesser half of the day, and the greater part for the capitalist. Being in semi-colonial dependence on foreign capital, Russian Tsarism in turn ruthlessly exploited and oppressed the peoples under its control. It was not for nothing that Tsarist Russia was called Lenin's prison of nations. In Tsarist Russia, open military violence and brigandage were combined with economic oppression, religious intoxication, and closing of the ways to enlightenment. With the exception of Ukraine and partly Baku, where foreign capital flowed especially abundantly, industrial production in the colonial outskirts of Tsarist Russia stood at an exceptionally low level. The large industry of Belorussia gave 1% of the output of all the large-scale industry of Russia in 1913, the industry of Georgia, 0.4%, the industry of Armenia, 0.15%, the industry of Tajikistan, 0.01%, etc. Pointing out that, according to Marx, the main features of the colony in the political and economic sense are 1. The availability of unoccupied, free lands, easily accessible to the settlers. 2. The existing world division of labor, the world market, thanks to which the colonies can specialize in mass production of agricultural products, receiving in exchange for them ready-made industrial products which, under other circumstances, they would have to manufacture themselves. Lenin in his work The Development of Capitalism in Russia, wrote that, the southern and eastern outskirts of the Hebrews, Russia, populated in the post-reform era, differ precisely in these features and represent themselves, in the economic sense, the colony of the Central Hebrew Russia. This concept of the colony is even more applicable to other outskirts, for example, to the Caucasus. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 3, p. 463. In the colonial outskirts of Tsarist Russia, particularly in the Caucasus, under the pressure of competition from the Russian factory industry, local handicraft production of industrial products fell and, thus, a colonial market for Russian capitalism was created. To preserve this market, Russian capitalism kept the colonial margins on the position of agricultural and raw materials appendages to the industrial center of European Russia. An example is the development of the cotton industry, which was almost entirely concentrated in the central industrial region, at a huge distance from its domestic resource base located in Central Asia and at a very considerable distance from seaports and land borders through which cotton was imported from abroad. The development of cotton production in Central Asia, Ukraine, based on imported cotton would mean for Russian cotton manufacturers a loss of these markets for their goods. The transformation of the outskirts into markets for the products of Russian capitalist industry and their use for agricultural colonization to a certain extent weakened the severity of the contradiction between capitalist large-scale industry and the remnants of serfdom in agriculture and slowed the resolution of this contradiction. Thus, the development of capitalism in breadth promoted the preservation of the remnants of serfdom in the economy of Tsarist Russia. This delayed the development of capitalism in it, which, in turn, caused further deepening of the contradictions of Russian capitalism. Along with this, to an even greater extent the colonial policy of Tsarism contributed to the preservation on the outskirts of the most backward economic forms. Tsarism, says Comrade Stalin, deliberately cultivated patriarchal feudal oppression on the outskirts in order to keep the masses in slavery and ignorance. Stalin, Marxism and the National Colonial Question, 1939, p. 81. Lenin repeatedly pointed out, as one of the peculiarities of Russian imperialism, that capitalist imperialism was intertwined here with military feudal imperialism, personified by Tsarism. In Russia, the monopoly of military force, vast territory or special convenience to plunder non-Russians, partly replenishes, partly replaces the monopoly of modern financial capital. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XIX, pages 309-310. Comrade Stalin says that Tsarist Russia was a hotbed of both capitalist, colonial and military oppression, and, moreover, in the most barbarous form, emphasizing that Tsarism was the focus of the most negative aspects of imperialism. Squared. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11. Comrade Stalin points out that as a result of this the struggle against Tsarism was at the same time a struggle against imperialism. The revolution against Tsarism was drawing closer to the revolution against imperialism, and it had to grow into a proletarian revolution. Russia was a key point of imperialist contradictions, and all the necessary objective and subjective conditions for a revolutionary solution of these contradictions were present in it. Russia's industrial development, both in terms of the size of industrial output and in terms of the degree of concentration of production, reached the beginning of an imperialist war at a level that made the victory of the proletarian revolution in Russia objectively possible and the building of socialism in it a victorious proletariat. Russia, Lenin points out, was not the weakest capitalist country, but a mediumly weak capitalist country. Without the known height of capitalism, Lenin wrote, we would not have succeeded in anything. Lenin Collected Book 11, p. 397. But the peculiarity of the Russian economy on the eve of the imperialist war lay in the fact that, despite the rather high rates of industrial development, it still lagged far behind the most developed capitalist countries. That, despite the rapid accumulation of domestic capital, it was semi-colonial dependent on foreign capital. That, along with the highly developed forms of the higher stage of capitalism, there are very significant remnants of serfdom, etc., etc. Thus, The contradictions peculiar to imperialism were intertwined in it with the contradictions characteristic of the feudal serf-old epoch. The working classes, the proletariat and the peasantry experienced the particularly severe oppression of all exploitation, capitalist, feudal, and colonial. That's why Russia, more than any other country, was pregnant with a revolution. Russia, says Comrade Stalin, was to become the nodal point of the contradictions of imperialism, not only in the sense that these contradictions were most easily revealed in Russia in view of the particularly ugly and especially intolerable nature of them, and not only because Russia was the most important support of Western imperialism, connecting the financial capital of the West with the colonies of the East, but also because only in Russia there was a real force capable of resolving the contradictions of imperialism in a revolutionary way. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11th, p. 6. This force was the revolutionary proletariat of Russia. The young Russian proletariat, educated and led by the party of Lenin and Stalin, enriched by the experience of the revolutionary battles of 1905–1907, was the most revolutionary in the world, and no revelry of reaction, which was intensified after 1905, could prevent the further growth of the proletariat, could not crush its revolutionary aspirations, could not prevent the new powerful upsurge of the revolutionary struggle. Already in December 1910, in the article, The Beginning of Demonstrations, Lenin wrote that after a certain retreat the proletariat again began to take the offensive. In 1911, according to the very understated figures of the industrialists themselves, more than 105,000 workers were on strike. But the real upsurge of the revolutionary movement began in April–May 1912 in connection with the Lena shooting, which stirred up the working masses and caused a huge explosion of revolutionary indignation. On April 4, 1912, more than 500 workers were killed and wounded in order to crush the economic strike of 6,000 workers in the Lena goldfields, in order to please the owners of the mines, the British capitalists, on the orders of the Tsarist gendarme officer. The proletariat responded to the Lena shooting with mass strikes, demonstrations and rallies in St. Petersburg, Moscow and all industrial centers of the country. Len's shots, wrote Comrade Stalin in 1912 in the Bolshevik newspaper Zvezda, broke the ice of silence, and the river of the people's movement began to move. Moved. Everything that was evil and pernicious in the modern regime, everything that suffered the long-suffering Russia, all this gathered in one fact, in the events on the Lena. That is why the Lena shot served as a signal of strikes and demonstrations. History of the CPSU, B. Short Course, p. 141. Lena strikes covered up to 300,000 workers. An even greater number of workers, about 400,000, took part in the May Day strikes of 1912. The strikes of 1912, like the strikes of the period of the First Russian Revolution, represented a combination of political and economic struggle. The political strikes prevailed at the same time and to a great extent. Of the more than 1 million workers who took part in the 1912 strikes, only 200,000 were accounted for by participants in economic strikes. In political strikes, there were about 900,000 workers. The liberals and the liberal workers' politicians, the liquidators, tried in every possible way to distort the character of the unfolding strike movement. The liquidators asserted that, before us is a strip of economic strikes. The liquidators and their ally Trotsky, frightened by the rise of the revolutionary struggle of the workers, wanted to replace the revolutionary strikes with the petition campaign. Of this venture, however, nothing happened. They managed to collect only 1,300 signatures, while hundreds of thousands of workers rallied around the Bolshevik Party. Judas Trotsky advanced a theory, according to which the only task of the strike movement of 1912 was allegedly a struggle for the freedom of coalitions. Concerning this vile slander, Lenin wrote, "There is nothing more deceitful than the liberal invention, repeated after the liquidators of Trotsky, As if the struggle for freedom of coalitions is the basis of both the Lena tragedy and its mighty echo in the country. Lenin, Works, Volume XV, p. 534. The desire to narrow the nature of the movement, to present it as a purely professional movement for freedom of association, was in the interests of the bourgeoisie, most afraid of the new revolutionary upsurge of the masses. In fact, the strike movement of 1912 was incomparably wider than what it wanted in it to see the liberal bourgeoisie, along with the liquidators and Trotsky. It testified to Russia's entry into the new powerful revolutionary upsurge. This rise was not accidental, but was prepared by all the conditions of Russian life for a long time. Lenin's execution was only an occasion for the transition of the revolutionary mood of the masses, which had already begun since the end of 1910, to the revolutionary upsurge of the masses. Lenin wrote, "Hundreds of thousands of the Petersburg proletariat, and behind them the workers of all parts of Russia, went on strike and street demonstrations not as one of the separate classes of bourgeois society, not with their own, only professional slogans, but as a hegemon, raising a banner of the revolution for the whole people, on behalf of the whole people, for the awakening and bringing to the struggle of all classes, to whom freedom is needed, who is able to achieve it." IBID, p. 541. The national significance of the mass strikes was that they were directed toward the emancipation of the entire working people of Russia, an exceptionally talented, industrious, capable, but strangled by the oppression of the autocracy. These strikes were directed toward the emancipation of the productive forces of Russia, its immense wealth, predatory lavished by a bloc of landowners and capitalists. Only the revolutionary abolition of the autocracy, and, after him, capitalism, could ensure the free development of the Russian and other peoples inhabiting Russia, the discovery of their versatile creative abilities, and at the same time the full disclosure and rational use of Russia's greatest natural resources. Therefore, these strikes provoked the sympathy of the vast majority of the working masses of the country. The unfolded mass strike movement was the beginning of a new, after 1905, stage of the struggle for the liberation of Russia from the oppression of the autocracy, a struggle that was to clear the way for the destruction of the oppression of capital as well. In particular, Lenin especially stressed the great importance of the revolutionary mass strike as a proletarian method of agitation, unification, rallying and involving in the struggle of the masses, a method first developed on a large scale in the First Russian Revolution and again, by a more solid hand applied by the proletariat in 1912. He pointed out that no power in the world could accomplish what the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat realizes by this method. The most backward strata of workers and peasants come into direct and indirect contact with strike's sheep. On the scene, hundreds of thousands of revolutionary agitators appear at once, whose influence is infinitely enhanced by the fact that they are inextricably linked with the lower classes, remain in their ranks, are struggling for the most urgent needs of any working-class family, unite with this direct struggle for pressing economic needs, a political protest in the struggle against the monarchy. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XV, pages 535–536. Nor should we forget, Lenin further pointed out, that mass strikes are inseparably linked with armed uprising. Lenin pointed out that the revolutionary movement of the proletariat in Russia had risen in 1912 to a higher level than in 1905. If in 1905, he wrote, it began with mass strikes and grenades, then in 1912, in spite of the police, the rout of the organizations of our party, the movement begins with mass strikes and the raising of the Republican banner. IBID, p. 541. The Sixth All-Russian Party Conference held in Prague in January 1912, which drove the Mensheviks out of the party and formalized the independent existence of the Bolshevik Party, was of utmost importance for the further development of the revolutionary working-class movement that began in 1912. A daily Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, published in St. Petersburg, played a huge role in strengthening Bolshevik organizations and in winning their influence among the masses. The release of the first issue of Pravda on April 22, May 5, 1912 was a holiday for the workers. Pravda systematically illuminated the lives of workers and peasants, their exploitation by the capitalists, landlords and kulaks. She educated in the workers' consciousness the unity of their interests and helped organize their performances. Pravda pointed out to the workers that a new revolution was to come, in which the proletariat must act as a leader and in which it would have a strong ally in the face of the revolutionary peasantry. Penetrating into the village, Pravda aroused the revolutionary energy of the advanced peasants. Thanks to Pravda, the struggle of the Bolsheviks for the expulsion of the liquidators from the legal organizations of the working class trade unions, people's homes, evening universities, clubs, insurance institutions, etc., was crowned with success. Another all-Russian legal body through which the Bolshevik Party during the years of the upsurge of the revolutionary movement, 1912–1914, conducted its revolutionary work among the masses was the Bolshevik faction in the Fourth State Duma, closely associated with the party's Central Committee, with Lenin and directly led by Comrade Stalin during his stay in St. Petersburg. Of great importance was the performance of the Bolshevik Party at the elections to the Fourth Duma in the autumn of 1912. The party came out on its own in the elections and put forward slogans: a democratic republic, an 8-hour working day, confiscation of the landowner's land. When in early October 1912 the Tsarist government attempted to violate the workers' election rights, the St. Petersburg Committee of the Bolshevik Party, at the suggestion of Comrade Stalin, called upon the workers of the largest enterprises to strike one day, and the government was forced to yield. The great majority of the workers gave their vote for Comrade Stalin's, the Order of the Petersburg Workers to their working MP. Lenin attached great importance to the nakaz. The nakaz stressed that Russia lives on the eve of the forthcoming mass movements, perhaps deeper than in the fifth year, history of the CPSU, b. the short course, p. 149, that the pioneer of these movements, as in the fifth year, will be the Russian proletariat, that only the peasantry can be an ally of the proletariat. The nakaz pointed out that the revolutionary people would have to fight on two fronts, both against the Tsarist government and against the liberal bourgeoisie seeking agreement with it. In the elections to the Duma, the Bolsheviks won all the major industrial centers. There are at least 4 or 5 of the working class of the country. Of the 9 elected workers' deputies, 6 were members of the Bolshevik Party. Cleverly combining illegal and legal work, steadfastly defending the interests of the working class, keeping close ties with the masses and waging an uncompromising struggle against the enemies of the workers' movement, the Bolsheviks also won other legitimate organizations of the proletariat. Strikes and demonstrations in 1912 clearly showed who the Russian working class is for. They showed that the working masses took the revolutionary slogans of the Bolsheviks and turned away from the liquidators, dragging them into the swamp of reformism, along with Trotsky. As a result of 2.5 years of persistent struggle against the liquidators for the restoration of the mass revolutionary workers' party, the Bolsheviks achieved the fact that by the summer of 1914, 4/5 of Russia's active workers were behind the Bolshevik Party and behind the Pravdist tactics IBID-P. The strikes of 1912 contributed to a clear disengagement of the class forces. They personally demonstrated that Russia is divided into 3 main political camps. 1. Camp of executioners and serfs, monarchies and secret police, a camp of rapid reaction. 2. The camp of the bourgeoisie, which is all, from the cadets. Before the Octobrists, he cries and groans, calling for reforms and declaring himself fools for assuming the idea of the possibility of reforms in Russia. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XVI, p. 490. 3. The camp of the revolution, headed by the proletariat and led by the Bolshevik Party. On the other hand, The 1912 movement fully confirmed the correctness of the Bolshevik tactics of the alliance with the peasantry, in particular the correctness of Lenin's thesis that in Tsarist Russia, approaching the new bourgeois democratic revolution, the political strike was the only serious means of raising the peasantry to the revolutionary struggle, the best part of the peasant army. Aroused by the rise of the labor movement and mass strikes, the peasants again rose to fight against the landowners. The peasant movement, which went on the decline during the years of reaction and increased allocation to the farm, 1907, 1909, from 1910 to 1911, reveals a new significant rise. The number of peasant performances for 1910, 1914. More than 13,000 revolutionary actions took place in the troops. In November 1912, on the streets of Petersburg, Riga, and Moscow, the proletariat extended a hand to the leading men of the peasant army, who heroically rose against the monarchy. IBID, p. 242. The best part of the army that rose up against the monarchy, following the workers, represented not only the army as such, but also the multi-million-strong masses of the peasantry. Stolypin's reform not only did not lead to the pacification of the village, as the Tsarist government hoped, but, on the contrary, entailed the acceleration and intensification of the process of class differentiation of the peasantry and the aggravation of class contradictions between its extreme groups. Lenin repeatedly stressed that the implementation of the Stolypin reform in the coming years would more incite the struggle within the peasantry than extinguish it, that the November 9th law only accelerates the division of the peasant masses into irreconcilably hostile and consciously political forces. IBID, Volume XIV, page 6. At the same time, the further ruin and impoverishment of the multi-million-strong masses of the small and medium-sized peasantry further aggravated his hostility toward the landlords, and the Tsarism that defended them further intensified their desire for the revolutionary abolition of landlordism, and increasingly convinced that the only salvation in alliance with the working class, in a joint revolutionary struggle against the autocracy and the remnants of serfdom. Exposing the counter-revolutionary essence of the Trotskyist denial of the role of the peasantry in the revolution, Lenin wrote in his article, On Two Lines of the Revolution: "The whole decade, the Great Decade, 1905-1915, proved the existence of two and only two class lines of the Russian Revolution. Stratification of the peasantry strengthened the class struggle within it, awoke many politically fallen elements, brought the rural proletariat closer to the urban proletariat, but the antagonism of the peasantry and the Markovs-Romanovs-Gustavs intensified, increased, and escalated. This is such an obvious truth that even thousands of phrases in dozens of Parisian articles by Trotsky are not refuted by her. Trotsky actually helps the liberal workers' politicians of Russia who, by denying the role of the peasantry, understand the unwillingness to raise the peasants to the revolution." IBID, Volume X8, pages 317-381. Exposing the left's phrases of Judas Trotsky, Lenin emphasized that the aggravation of class contradictions in the countryside proceeds along two lines. 1. Along the line of antagonism between the peasantry as a whole, in its bulk, and the feudal landowners, led by the Romanovs. 2. Along the line of antagonism between the peasant bourgeoisie and the rural proletariat and the semi-proletariat. The remnants of serfdom and corvée exploitation in the country conditioned the revolutionary nature of the vast masses of the peasantry, their readiness for a revolutionary struggle against the landlords and the Tsarist autocracy in alliance with the proletariat, whose leadership alone could only provide them with complete victory, complete elimination of the remnants of serfdom, bringing the bourgeois end. On the other hand, the growth of capitalism and capitalist exploitation in the countryside has led such a deep furrow between the peasant bourgeoisie and the poorest peasantry, The class disintegration of the peasantry and the class struggle in it have become so acute that in the person of the proletarian and semi-proletarian elements of the village, in the person of the poorest peasantry, the proletariat had a reliable ally for the transition from a bourgeois democratic revolution to a proletarian, socialist revolution. Finally, the colonial policy of Tsarism, the cruel exploitation of the working people of the colonial provinces of Tsarist Russia, facilitated the proletariat's establishment of an alliance with the peasantry of these suburbs, and its attraction to the side of the revolution. The wave of mass revolutionary strikes, so high in 1912, in the following years rose even higher. In 1913, 72,000 workers were on strike. With the onset of 1914, workers' strikes began to unfold with renewed vigor, becoming more and more stubborn and capturing an increasing number of workers. In total, before the outbreak of the war in 1914, 1,425,000 workers were on strike. The general strike of oil industry workers, which began in May 1914 in Baku, received the broadest response. In protest at the ferocious measures taken by the police against the Baku workers, and as a sign of solidarity with the latter, the workers in Moscow and other areas went on strike. On July 3, during the rally at the Putilov factory in St. Petersburg about the Baku strike, the police opened fire on workers. This caused a huge excitement of the St. Petersburg proletariat. On July 4, in St. Petersburg, according to the appeal of the Petersburg Committee of the party, 90,000 workers went on strike in protest. On July 7, 130,000 went on strike. On July 8, 150,000. On July 11, 200,000. All the plants were seized with excitement. Rallies and demonstrations took place everywhere. It came to trying to build barricades. Barricades were also built in Baku and Lodz. At several points, the police shot at workers. To suppress the movement, the government took extraordinary measures. The capital was turned into a military camp. Pravda was closed. But at that time a new force of the international order, imperialist war, appeared on the scene, which was to change the course of events. The Tsarist government took advantage of the war in order to crush the Bolshevik organizations and suppress the labor movement. The upsurge of the revolution was interrupted by a world war in which the Tsarist government sought salvation from the revolution. History of the CPSU, B. Short course, pages 150 to 153.